guys, so today we're going to talk about atmospheric perspective, which you might have heard of called by another name aerial perspective. And that's basically how things look as they move back in space. And instead of talking about the lines and the shapes and the forms and how they look when they go back in space, we're actually going to be talking about the value and the color. But in this case, we're just looking at black and white. So we're just talking about how the value changes as you move back in space. Let's take a look at some images and I'll explain the concept to you and give you a couple of different methods that you can use in your own black and white drawings. Okay, so in order to talk about what atmospheric perspective is, first we have to establish what it isn't. You've probably heard the word perspective before, but usually we're talking about linear perspective. So I want to show you an example of linear perspective, and I'm going to use this book that was written by one of my students, Jane Carter Barrett, and she came to me because she wanted to illustrate the novel that she had written into a coloring book, and this is the coloring book. So we worked on a couple of different images together, and then she hired somebody else to do some of the other images. So this image was one that we worked on together, and this is an example of linear perspective. So linear perspective are where the angles and the lines form a sense of depth. So you can see that with these angles here of the room and the fireplace and the bricks on the walls and the stones in the floor and the picnic table, all of those lines convey a sense of depth. They help us understand the 3D space that she's trying to depict, even though it's flat on the page. So that's one example. That's linear perspective. Let's look at what atmospheric perspective is. So here's a photograph that I took a long time ago at a lake in Switzerland. This is actually a color photograph, believe it or not, but it was just a really gray, misty day. And while I was on the lake on a boat, there were sequential hills that were moving back in space. And because it was such a misty gray day, as the hills got farther away from me, they appeared lighter and lighter and lighter in value because there were more particulates of water or mist or rain droplets in the air. There's also pollution and dust and then other contaminants that are in our air that wind up making it so that as we're looking at something that's moving back in space away from us, we can actually see less and less of it, and it changes the way that the color or the value is perceived because of that depth away from our eyes. So that's what atmospheric perspective is. So next I'm going to show to you 3 different approaches for using atmospheric perspective in your black and white drawings. We can look at the near areas and either make them the areas that are closest to our eye, darker darks, or we can make them middle grays and lights, or we can make them high contrast with the full value scale. And then our far areas will correspond to that. So if we're making darker darks in the front, the far areas will have middle grays and our lighter lights. If the near area has middle grays and lights, the far area will have darker darks. And if the near area has high contrast and a full value scale, the far area will have a muted value scale with just middle grays. Let's look at our first option. This is the most common option that you're going to see in nature, where the near areas are a darker dark and the farther away from you areas are going to be perceived as lighter, or sometimes in color it will be more blue. So this example of the lake in Switzerland that I showed you earlier is the best example that I have of this. You can see that the hills and mountains that are closest to us are darkest, and then they slowly, gradually fade and turn lighter and lighter and lighter in the value scale as they move back away in space. Next, we're going to look at an option where the closer areas are lighter. Okay, so this way of perceiving things in atmospheric perspective is a little bit less common in nature. You'll see it sometimes, but it's going to be a subtle difference. So it's a little bit harder for me to find examples of this for you in nature. But here you can see both a color photograph and a black and white photograph of the same thing. This is a scene in West Texas. I took the photograph myself, And you can see that the grasslands that are nearest to the camera, sort of right by my foot, those are brighter bright in the front. And then as the plane of grass moves away from the camera, it gets darker dark. Again, it's really subtle. It's not going to be something that's like glaringly obvious, like when the darks are in front, but there are times where you will see this in nature, and really all that matters is that you're showing contrast from the foreground to the background. So if you make it lighter light in the front, that's fine. You just need to make it a darker dark as it moves away from you to be able to convey that sense of depth. Let's look at another example. Here's a photograph that I took in Colorado. You can see that the brights in the fence and the path in the foreground are just a little tiny bit brighter. Again, it's subtle. It's not a huge difference, but then as the path moves back away from you, and as the fence gets smaller and recedes in space, those brights are perceived as less bright. So not a huge difference, but enough of a difference that you can employ this and use this and exaggerate it in your drawings to make a sense of depth, as long as you make contrast between the foreground and the background. The third option is the one that I like to use the most. Again, it's a little bit more difficult to find examples of it where you can see it really clearly in nature, but it seems to work really well in a black and white drawing. So this option, I'm going to have more contrast between my values up close in the foreground, and then less contrast as I move back in space. The way that this works is that in the foreground, I'm going to use a full value scale. I'll maybe use a 2 to a 9 on the value scale, maybe eliminating the black and the white because that's so harsh, I don't need that much contrast. And then as I move back into the background, I'm going to use a more muted, dull value scale. So just some values in the middle, like maybe 4, 5, 6, something that's just really close. All the values are close to each other so that they're similar and there's less contrast. In this example, another scene of a photo that I took, I believe this was in New Mexico. I've turned it black and white for y'all to see. And you can see that the taller plants in the foreground are a darker dark, and the grass or sandy area in the foreground is a lighter light. And then as you move to the midground, those values become closer to each other. So the darks are less dark, the lights are less light, they're more in the middle of the value scale. So again, this is one where it's a little bit more difficult to find in real life, but you can employ this and use this in your drawing so that it really shows a sense of space. Okay, so hopefully all of those photos and those 3 different options help you to understand not only what the concept is of atmospheric perspective, but will give you a few different ways that you can then apply it to your black and white graphite drawings.